Hi everybody, welcome to the latest instalment of our Ex Situ series. I'm Alex Tozer. I am the Operation Wallace Director of Operations. You will recognise, I think Sophia would, from the interviewer's chair from previous week's Q&A sessions in the Ex Situ series. However, today the tables are turned and the spotlight is on Sophia. We're very lucky to have Sophia with us. She's quite a rare creature in the world of conservation, in that she thinks with a business head, which is very, very important. And she's very good at thinking her way around some of the challenges that we're met with on a regular basis in the line of work that we do. I hope you've had a chance to watch Sophia's talk, which is putting Indigenous communities at the centre of conservation efforts. We're going to be asking her some questions about that today. If you've got any questions, then please feel free to put them either in the chat on either Facebook or YouTube, or you can email us at exitu@opwall.com. If you're watching from the Opwall website, if you click the YouTube button, it'll open the stream in a new tab that will give you access to the chat. All right, so Sophia, we're talking about what is probably the most important issue and challenge in conservation in terms of running effective conservation projects, which is how to bring your stakeholder communities, Indigenous and otherwise, on board. So it's a pretty big topic, and there must be, that there are thousands and thousands of challenges that you're faced with when you're doing this, when you're working in conservation. So perhaps we can start off with just some of the practical and logistical concerns with doing that. How do you get about working in a meaningful way in Indigenous communities when you don't speak the language? How can you effectively communicate and ensure that there is free consent and informed consent with those communities? How do you do that?
So it's a really good question. Thanks for the introduction, Alex, and nice to see you and have the tables turned a little bit. It's a tricky question, but I think it's got a relatively simple solution, which is generally to ensure that you're bringing in a translator or anthropologist who does speak the language, or that you're hiring somebody in the community who can translate for you to the language that you can speak. That being said, I think there's a lot to be said for learning various languages ourselves. If you're someone who would like to work with stakeholder communities, I think that at least having basic knowledge of a few different widely spoken languages like Spanish, English, French, etc., can get you a long way, especially towards then being able to communicate with your translator in country. So you may well find an amazing Indigenous translator in Ecuador who speaks Shuar, but they will probably also speak Spanish, not English. And so being able to do the direct connection with a translator makes a huge difference. But I also think a translator is an amazing thing, and it's also a really great way to work closely with someone local, especially if you can find someone who has that language capacity. I was really lucky to be able to do that when I did my research in Kenya, and I'm incredibly grateful to my translator, not only for obviously translating direct language issues, but also explaining cultural concerns, which is why it's a huge boon to be able to have a local Indigenous translator, someone from the community. But also I think there's something to say for anthropologists or ethnographers, people who might be from outside the community, but who have done years and years of research within a community. I think that's more expensive and complicated and might be something that a lot of conservation projects won't think about, just because I think probably a lot of biologists don't even necessarily know how to work with an anthropologist or bring an anthropologist into a project. But we have an anthropologist on site every year in the Ecuador projects, which I think is essential to ensuring that there's someone whose full role is talking to the community and checking on them and making sure that the relationship continues to be something that's positive for them. Because I think another thing when we talk about free and informed consent in any case, including stakeholders, is that consent is not a one-time thing. It's a constant process. You don't just expect someone says yes to something one time and they'll say yes to it 1,000 other times. So I think bringing in anthropologists who obviously have worked there for many years, can speak the language and communicate well, can have a major role in ensuring the success of conservation projects.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned the cultural side of it as well, because of course it's not just about the language, and having the anthropologist there can mean you perhaps have a better insight into some of the cultural barriers that you might face. Can you think of any examples where you've come up against difficult sort of cultural problems when you've been working on the different projects you've done?
Yeah, I would say the cultural barriers that you can come up with when putting science and kind of indigenous belief systems on conflicting planes are endless. Just because I would say we have a very limited understanding going into these projects of what local communities believe. Actually, the one I can think of just off the top of my head that might be a bit different than what people might expect is I would say most people, when we talk about this kind of thing, would expect the challenges that we've seen very publicly in terms of, for example, hunting of endangered species that are culturally important to communities. So, for example, like whales, I think is one that ends up being a really big global discussion. But I actually want to take it kind of my anecdote is a very different side of this, which would be actually communities being against killing certain species. So when we were in Fiji with Opwal in 2017, we were putting out some traps for herps, looking for lizards, and finding it was incredibly difficult to catch any herps on the island because of the number of mongoose and other invasive small mammal species and rats and stuff like that. And one of our herp traps caught a rat, and the rat drowned in the trap, which obviously as conservationists, we do not want any animals to die, but this was an invasive species or a species that's not particularly threatened. And so our scientists were relatively unconcerned about the rat and pretty much just took it back to camp and were ready to just get rid of it. And the community was horrified because the rat was the symbol of their community. And each community in Fiji has an animal and a plant symbol that represents their community, and that if it is harmed, signifies that their community will come to some kind of harm, or if they disrespect it in some way. And so they were extremely upset and were even questioning the research that we were doing on their land because it had resulted in the death of this rat, which to them was a huge and upsetting sign. And it required a lot of conversation with our local guides and with the cooks to ensure that the Western scientists who had kind of seen this as it's just a rat were able to sit down and have a conversation and ensure that everyone was on the same page and that there was a respectful passage of this rat, so that the community continued to accept our work there. And I think those kinds of situations happen a lot more than we expect. And I wanted to bring that one up because it's not as much, it's actually kind of the opposite of most of the situations where we're seeing communities' rituals kind of against conservation. But actually, I think a lot of the time, communities' rituals can be a part of our conservation efforts, but we need to know what they are and how to involve them, and making very clear, hard statements about, for example, hunting and fishing and stuff like that in territories that belong to indigenous people or have historically been used by humans is really, really difficult to implement. And you end up creating a lot more enemies rather than supporters.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is just all about making sure that the voice is able to be heard surrounding those cultural issues. I mean, the story about the rat is very, very interesting indeed, and certainly reflective of challenges that are faced all over the world when you're trying to help facilitate conservation work. When you're sort of going through that process, when you're talking to the communities, when you're talking to various people within them, how do you ensure that all the voices are actually able to be heard? Because you can go to one person in the community. Is there one person to go to, or do you tend to sort of just throw it out there to anybody who will listen?
So this is where it kind of gets difficult into what I was saying about, a one size fits all solution. Every single community looks really different in terms of their leadership and decision making structure, which again, I think brings back the point of it's worthwhile to have an anthropologist who is experienced with these communities, especially if you're going to be working with them for a long-term project. But that being said, I think our first anthropologist in Ecuador had kind of a really nice rule for figuring out how to ensure you are getting the right information from a community, any community really, which was kind of, once you've heard it 3 times from 3 different people who were unrelated, there's some truth to it. And that also came up when I was doing my thesis research. So, interviewing communities in Ecuador, Chile, Kenya, Fiji, wherever it was, doesn't really matter how big the community is. Once you start to reach a critical mass of 20, 40 people, you start to hear the same story over and over again. And you can start going, okay, I've talked to the critical mass. And so usually that rule of obviously ensuring that you're getting a kind of randomized sample from the community, but once you're starting to hear the same thing 3 times, you can usually start to say there's some grain of truth to it, and you can move forward from there.
Okay, thank you. I wanted, if I could, to ask a little bit about some of the legalities and the sort of enforceability of some of the conservation work that we do. You mentioned in your talk about the protection of indigenous environments and being ratified by the Ecuadorian government, for example, as well as lots of other governments all around the world, but not actually having any legal status. So how, on a legal and political level then, can those communities in practice actually protect the areas that they're in? Because you're talking about potentially a massive conflict where the classic one, I suppose, is a government or an oil company wanting to go through the Amazonian rainforest and to take out all the trees, whether it's to drill for oil. And that the money that could potentially generate for indigenous communities could be really quite substantial.
Definitely.
So how do you sort of manage, or how do they manage that conflict where they've potentially got no legal backing anyway for defending against that action happening, and there's a great big carrot at the end of it as well with money for allowing that sort of development? So how do you even approach gathering support for the conservation perspective, i.e. keeping everything standing where it is and saying no to the oil company?
So, I think you've probably touched on the question that's launched and driven my entire career. So I would say I'm very far from answering that question in its entirety, but it's certainly one that keeps me up at night.
That's a good question. We can.
It's definitely a good question, and I hope to have a better answer, in a few years. But I obviously there are answers to this question, and but it's clearly still a massive and controversial topic because, again, also you are looking at communities in such a diverse variety of circumstances. In terms of their poverty and previous relationship with governments, you're looking at communities all over the world, and you're looking at individuals within communities. We're thinking about, I always bring this up to students in Ecuador when we're talking about the community and say, do you think all 30 of you sitting at the table right now, if you had 10 minutes, could make a decision about what we were going to have for dinner, if you could pick from anything in the world? And I don't think that they could. So, if you're asking 800 people to decide, do we make $45 million or do we continue our life as is? I would say that's not a decision that's going to be very easily made just within a few conversations. And it's certainly not going to ever be completely resolved, I think. And so that's why this continues to come up. But I think, at least from my perspective and kind of bringing this into the business side, I genuinely think that one of the best ways to ensure that these areas remain protected is by showing that there is financial benefit both to the national government and to the community that is actually far and above the financial benefit of cutting it down. And when you start to look at the numbers surrounding tourism, but also some other industries, but especially tourism, you can see that actually the tourism industry to protected areas and biodiverse areas of the world invested about 60 times more money into those areas than conservation did. Like, I think about $600 million versus $10 million. And
Wow.
so, and that any dollar that's spent within really biodiverse communities around the world generally is multiplied by 7x in its effects on the rest of the economy. And so when you start to look at the value of especially large charismatic species that are particularly endangered, but also just these forests in general, or wilderness areas, because I think I just tend towards rainforest because I work in rainforest, but obviously we're talking about rainforests, islands, savannas, deserts, and all of these interesting, beautiful ecosystems around the world. And when you look at the value of those ecosystems, of course, not just in terms of ecosystem services and the amazing things that they're doing to support our human existence, but also in terms of how much money they can generate, I think there is a strong argument towards protection. And I think for me, one of the best examples of this is exclusively gorilla tourism in Uganda, and the 3 other countries that have gorilla tourism, but Uganda specifically. Gorilla tourism to see the, maybe 40 gorillas that they have, or 100 something gorillas that they have, brought nearly $40 million into the Ugandan government in 2015. And it was enough money to convince them to fully protect gorillas, like 100%. So those kinds of successes are what makes it clear that tourism is a potential way to convince governments that they could make as much money and for a much longer time. So with oil, it might be $40 million or $1 billion for 10 years, and then you have completely destroyed that area. It will never do anything again. It is a mud pit forever. Whereas you could make $40 million a year forever by protecting the gorillas. So obviously there's short-term versus long-term.
It's a pretty compelling argument. You often hear arguments against tourism. It's not unusual to hear some arguments against it.
Definitely.
But the argument you're making, particularly the economic argument, is, I think, very, very powerful indeed. When you do hear the arguments against tourism, one of them that quite often comes up is that it can be seen as either being patronizing or colonial to go into remote communities and be sort of pushing tourism development in those places. How do you feel about that? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge and valid question, and actually is kind of the question that got me into this whole line of research. So before I answer it, I think if you're really interested in that question, one of the best resources out there is The Ethics of Sightseeing by Dean McCannell, which I put on my slide in the resources page. It is one of my Bibles, and just goes into how to be an ethical tourist, really. And I think with this, it comes down to a few factors. Obviously, the free and informed consent, but also I think it goes beyond that to these businesses, if we're talking about implementing tourism, should be community owned and led. So I truly believe, and the reason I did the research that I did in my undergraduate dissertation, I truly believe that the only way that these businesses and money going into tourism will have lasting and sustainable positive impact on the local environment is for the communities to be the by far the majority benefactors, or the
Yeah.
largest benefactors of this. And there's tons of arguments toward why community-based tourism is an ethical argument. Just because the communities are being visited, they feel the impact of the people being there. It obviously affects them in some negative ways as well. And so therefore they should be the people who make the most off of it. But I think also, if we're talking about the environment, the community that lives there and whose day-to-day life depends on that environment, needs to be the groups that are making the income off of it. So there are plenty of tour operations around the world that are potentially well-meaning, but are working in communities and not providing those communities with the full income from their labor. And I think it is, so colonial-like tourism operations exist to this day, for sure. And I think it's one of those things where we can, as consumers, we get to vote with our dollars and choose businesses that are, rather than going in and using this community for, it's a cultural display or a tour and then leaving and paying them, a small amount of money. You should be doing the research and finding community-led operations, agencies that are empowering communities to lead their own operations and just helping them get more tourists, and that have, and helping them develop programs that also protect wildlife. I think also, there are challenges to going to these really remote communities as a tourist that also require you as a tourist to kind of, buck up and learn about the community before going. I think that's our responsibility if we want to visit these really remote and beautiful areas and really fascinating rural communities, is we have a responsibility to educate ourselves, and the tour operator that's bringing you has some responsibility to educating you. So I think part of getting around that is ensuring that it's, one, community owned and led, and two, that there's sufficient education before going in, that you're not going in and stepping on people's toes, but rather you're working with them and getting to fully appreciate the experience. And it will definitely make the experience better.
I mean, I guess you wouldn't, you wouldn't be wanting to put anybody off going by the fact that you've got to be careful about who you go to these places with, because there are loads of good operators out there, as well as
Absolutely.
there being quite a lot of bad ones. But I guess it's just all about, like you said, it's about being aware of the restrictions and about being aware of the different culture that you're potentially stepping into by doing something like this, and the massive benefits that it can bring to you personally, as well as to that community, by you voting with your dollars and going to those.
Definitely. And you can do your research. I mean, the fact is that if you're going with a tour operator that's based in your home country, you should be checking to see what percentage of the money that you're spending on them is staying in the country that you're visiting. And they should be transparent about that. And if they're not that transparent about it, I would probably just look for a different operator. And going with an operator that is local to the country that you are in is one of the easiest ways to guarantee that at least the money that you're spending on your tour is staying in the country that you are in, and that it's going to have some kind of impact, even if it's not the absolute most ethical tour operator that you could find.
How does that fit in with Friends of Wallacea then? So you're spearheading this new organisation, which is really going to be all about bringing people into communities that are on the frontier of conservation, vital conservation areas. But Friends of Wallacea is not based out in all of those communities necessarily. So how do you sort of marry those two things together?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really fair question. And certainly it's something that, as we're continuing to build this initiative, we are continuing to find ways to improve our financial structure so that our communities can benefit the most possible. Now, we are transparent about our finances with Friends of Wallacea. Over 85% of the income that we make through the business ends up in the communities, like directly within these communities. And also, I think we fall into the first category of operator that I was bringing up, which is working with partner communities So we exclusively are working with community-led initiatives, and it's very decentralized in terms of how our tours are operated. So, we aren't managing anybody from a top-down standpoint. We aren't operating, sending a bunch of English and American people to these countries to set things up or to operate these things. We are setting up and training and capacity building with these communities and partnering with existing tour operations in these communities to help them grow and reach a bigger audience. But they continue to be community led, and that is a huge and important part of our model, and something that we want to keep supporting so that our communities can be the number one benefactors. Not only is it the right thing to do, but is actually the only way that our business actually achieves its mission of successfully protecting biodiversity in all of these different areas.
It's a super exciting initiative. I mean, and I think it's got to be the way forward for so much of conservation is that focus on community involvement and community led projects. We have got less than 5 minutes left now, so now is the last chance to ask any questions for anybody that's watching live. One of the questions that we've been asked is about the potential impacts of COVID-19 on initiatives like Friends of Wallace here, but also in a more general sense, the communities that we're working with all over the world, and the communities that are at the forefront of conservation challenges. How would something like COVID-19 have impacted them?
So there's two sides. Obviously, there's the economic and the health impacts of COVID-19, just as we are seeing literally everywhere else on Earth. Now, I'm going to talk quickly about the health impacts because I think that's one side of it. That's the first that we will see, which is COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting Indigenous communities worldwide. The death rate from COVID-19 in the Navajo Nation in the United States of America is higher than 7 combined states in the United States. Now, that says a lot about the access to healthcare in Indigenous communities in one of the most developed countries on Earth. And, many of these communities live in extremely remote areas with no access to healthcare and very little ability to get out to areas with access to healthcare. And therefore, COVID-19 is an existential threat to the continued survival of especially extremely remote Indigenous communities. And looking even just at the history of Latin America or all of the Americas, disease was one of the major, ethnicide factors that ended up with a lot of Indigenous communities just disappearing because disease entered their territory. We won't know the impact of this disease on a health standpoint with these communities probably for a long time because they may never be tested. But we've certainly started hearing about Indigenous communities in the Amazon, both in Ecuador and in Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil, are getting ill partially because miners are coming into their territory illegally and getting them sick. So it's a major concern, and something that, unfortunately as conservationists, I'm not sure exactly how we tackle. But on the other side, on the economic side, obviously COVID-19 has totally stopped the tourism industry. And that includes us. But on the other hand, I think that it gives us a really unprecedented opportunity to look at how we can restructure the tourism industry and innovate in an industry that has been innovating really slowly, but that now could be completely shaken up by the fact that a lot of tour operators are going to go out of business, and a lot of them are going to be looking for better ways to do their business as the consumers become increasingly millennials and Gen Z and people who are saying, we don't want to go somewhere if we're going to hurt people. And so there's an opportunity to create this regenerative tourism model, which goes beyond sustainability and looks for net positive impact on communities and environments. And hopefully Friends of Wallace will be one of the companies that can lead that in showing tour operators around the world how working directly in these communities that protect areas of high biodiversity can create net positive impacts from travel in these areas. So it's a tough time to launch a tourism business, but I am taking it with optimism. And I think we have now an opportunity that we didn't have before this crisis to have a larger impact on the tourism industry worldwide, in terms of shifting impacts, shifting positive benefits into rural and indigenous communities and areas of high biodiversity in ways that can really protect wildlife.
Such an exciting time, massively exciting opportunity to be able to do something now. But as you say, probably the worst time ever to launch a tourism business.
Yes, definitely. It certainly felt like that for the first few months, but now that things are starting to open up a little bit in Europe, I think we're feeling a bit more optimism.
Good. I'm glad about that. What kind of inspired you to actually do what you do? What was your path that took you into this place that you're currently in?
So, I mean, I guess it's a long path, but the current Friends of Wallacea work, I think, was really inspired by the Sani Isla community in Ecuador and seeing how successful their model has been and how inspirational they are in terms of other communities also emulating their model along the Amazon and protecting so much forest. I've been so lucky to work there for the last couple of years and get to experience that place and see how wild and incredible it is, and also how committed the people are to protecting it. And I thought that, this model has value and it can be expanded, and we can even help them make more money and be more stable so that this can continue time infinite, basically. I would be basically a whole nother conversation to talk about how I ended up going from interested in sustainable tourism to ending up on Apwal in Fiji and then going down this path. But the actual project of Friends of Wallacea really came out of the inspiration of Sani.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Is there anyone before we close that you wanted to shout out on social media or anything like that? Any shout outs you wanted to give?
Yeah, so we are actually launching our first programs with Friends of Wallacea tomorrow. So as Europe is starting to open up, we've been looking at travel clusters and who might be able to travel in these different areas. And I realize travel might be the last thing on everybody's mind right now. So these programs are really specifically within Europe and within countries that currently are able to travel across each other's borders. We're hoping to do similar programs in other travel clusters in the future, but right now this is just Europe. And so we are launching internships both in Croatia and Romania. So our Croatia site we have in Krka National Park, and then also on Silba Island, where you would be able to dive and work at a marine research center. And in Transylvania, which is in this beautiful traditional Saxon home in the Transylvanian countryside, where there are bears and wild boar and deer, and it is just one of the most beautiful places on earth.
Sounds terrible.
Yeah, no, I'm very jealous that I don't get to spend my summer there. So these programs are basically for people who are interested in just launching their career, who might have not had the opportunity to travel this year, would have had summer travel, would have gone on a trip like Upwall or done study abroad or done a gap year, and how now, are kind of re-examining life and wondering how to continue to give back to local communities. And while you might not be able to travel nearly as far as you might have hoped, these are opportunities to give back actually within the European community in some of the last kind of frontiers of wilderness that exist in Europe. I mean, Romania is arguably the wildest country remaining in Europe, but also if you just look at pictures of Krka National Park, I mean, you'll be ready to go there in about 5 seconds.
It's absolutely unbelievable, isn't it? It's just such a stunning location.
So these programs are a great way to build skills relating to conservation, but also jobs in sustainable business, ecology management, all of these different kinds of fields, really any field you might want to enter, because you would be, you'll be working on projects like mammal monitoring through camera traps, bird point counts, but then also building sustainable tourism operations out of these places and helping build the business model as we're growing, helping with sustainable agriculture, educating local communities about conservation and how to be involved. And so these are really, really cool opportunities. I totally would have done this while I was just in university or coming out of university. They last for 2 to 8 weeks. In these areas. The spots are really limited this year just because of the social distancing policy. So the main important thing is, if you think these programs would be interesting to you, sign up for our waitlist at friendsofwallacea.org/waitlist. If you're on that waitlist, you will get priority booking and a discount. on the deposit fees. So I highly recommend you signing up. We are launching these programs tomorrow at 5 p.m. UK time for bookings. And once people put in their deposits, that's how you hold your spot. So get on the wait list, check your email at 5 tomorrow so that you can hold your spot. And we hope that you can join us this year. And if you want any more information, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at Wallacea Friends.
Fantastic. All right, well, good luck. I hope it all works. I hope that the Friends of Wallacea can get some people out there, because I think it sounds like a fantastic opportunity. And thank you very much as well for the very interesting talk on Indigenous communities and conservation, and being able to answer all of our questions here today. If anybody has any more questions, then please feel free to email Sophia. You can send them through to Ex Situ, that's EXSITU @opwall.com, and then we can pass them on to Sophia. But otherwise, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. There's so many more questions. I wish we could have had more time to ask. There's lots more questions that we can ask about. I think it's such an important topic that you could probably talk about it all afternoon, and probably if you get involved in conservation, you probably will spend days talking about some of these issues. So there's an awful lot to cover. Thank you very much again, Sophia. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you next week for our next installment of Ex Situ. Bye.
Yeah, thanks so much. Bye.